It's 3:30 in the morning on a quiet residential street in South Manchester. Inside a semi-detached house on Platt Lane, a 64-year-old grandfather is asleep in his own bed. The family dog is curled up downstairs. The house is still, the night ordinary, until a figure in a balaclava appears outside. He moves silently through the dark, finds an upstairs window that's been left open, and slips inside. What happens next lasts 90 seconds. In that time, the man in the balaclava stabs the grandfather 77 times, face, head, body, until his jugular vein is severed and the bedroom is unrecognizable. Then he climbs back out, scales the garden fences of neighboring houses, and walks away into the dark. The killer's name is Direece Roche, and here is the part that stops you cold. 9 months before that morning, Roche had walked out of prison a free man. Not through a loophole, not on a technicality, but because the parole board, prison psychologists, and a high court judge had all looked at him and reached the same conclusion. Reformed, safe, ready. This isn't a story about a system that stopped paying attention. It's the story of a man who studied exactly what that system needed to see and gave it to them without flinching. For nearly a decade, and the moment he was free, someone paid for it with his life. This is the Direece Roche case, the Platt Lane murder, Manchester 2024. And it forces a question that sits like a stone in your chest. When deception is this skilled, when manipulation is this patient, can a system built on rehabilitation ever truly tell the difference between someone who's changed and someone who's simply learned to perform? To understand how this happened, you first have to go back 13 years. Welcome to UK True Crime Files, where we dig into the cases that scar Britain's communities, giving voice to the victims at their heart. If you're new here, please subscribe. Your support keeps these stories coming straight to your feed. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this case. It starts conversations that matter. To understand Roche, you first have to understand where he came from and who he grew up alongside. Direece Roche and his older brother Owen were raised in Stockport, Greater Manchester. By the time Direece was a teenager, the two of them had carved out a reputation in their neighborhood that went beyond the ordinary trouble that follows young men with too much anger and not enough direction. People who knew them locally had taken to calling the brothers the Krays, a reference to the infamous Kray twins who ran the East London underworld in the 1960s. It wasn't meant as flattery. It was recognition of the fact that the Roche brothers were violent, intimidating, and seemingly indifferent to the consequences of their behavior. Owen was the older of the two, and in many ways, the more reckless. By early 2011, he was already wanted by police, and he had been charged with assault and false imprisonment of his girlfriend, and had staged a dramatic escape from court, a breakout mid-proceedings, before going on the run. He was, at that moment, a fugitive. It was Owen's situation that set the chain of events in motion. On the night of New Year's Eve 2010 and into the early hours of 1st January 2011, the two brothers were in the Earlham's The Height area of Salford. They had gone looking for Owen's girlfriend. The search took them to a house party, and the hunt for one woman on a cold New Year's morning led them into contact with other people who had been there that night. One of those people was Adam Steele. Adam was 23 years old and worked as a care worker, spending his days looking after the older and more vulnerable members of the community. And he had nothing to do with Owen's girlfriend. He had nothing to do with whatever dispute the Roche brothers were carrying. He was simply there, outside the flat, when an argument erupted. During the confrontation, Roche, 16 years old, pulled a knife from his waistband. What happened next appears to have been fueled not by cold calculation, but by a chaotic, reactive violence. Roche later claimed he feared Adam was a threat to his brother. Whether that was true or not, what he did was drive the knife into Adam Steele's chest and walk away, leaving him to die on the pavement. Adam Steele died from his wounds. He was a care worker who had spent New Year's Eve doing what young people do. He never saw the morning. Roche was 16, and he admitted murder at Manchester Crown Court and was sentenced to life in prison, ordered to serve a minimum of 12 years before he could be considered for parole. The trial judge, in sentencing him, pointed directly at Owen as the corrupting influence on his younger brother's life, describing Owen as having failed Roche. Owen himself was convicted of manslaughter and handed an indeterminate sentence with a minimum of 4 years and 4 months. The judge's words about Owen were well-intentioned. What they couldn't account for was that the boy at the center of this, Roche himself, had pulled the knife. Whatever his older brother's influence, the choice had been his. And prison, as it turned out, would not soften him. At least, not at first. The early years of his sentence were not straightforward. Prison reports from that period note that he was repeatedly disciplined, including for fighting and assaulting prison officers. This was a volatile, angry young man serving time for a killing he had committed at 16. The environment of a young offender institution and then a full adult prison is not one that tends to smooth those edges quickly. But in 2014, something shifted. According to prison reports, Roche began to reflect, genuinely it appeared, on his behavior and the direction of his life. He withdrew from contact with Owen and with other criminal associates he had known on the outside. He threw himself into education and rehabilitation programs. He became, by the accounts of multiple prison staff, a changed man. Prison changed Roche, or at least it appeared to. Prison reports described him as having shown wisdom beyond his years. He was characterized as a linchpin of a small therapy group, someone who had become a stabilizing presence for other prisoners going through difficult periods. He raised money for charity. He planned to study for a psychology degree. In 2019, the High Court reviewed whether Roche's minimum term should be reduced. His defense team argued he deserved credit for his transformation. A judge, Mr. Justice Nicole, reviewed the prison reports and described them as very encouraging. But Nicole stopped short of reducing the sentence. He noted that the positive changes were real, but that it was still early days, and that Roche had yet to prove his violent past was well and truly past history. He would need more time, more evidence, so Roche gave them more evidence, and he continued to build his record. By the time the parole board came to consider his release, the case file read like a rehabilitation success story. He was moved to HMP Kirkham in Lancashire, a Category D open prison, the lowest security classification in the estate, used for prisoners who are considered low risk and are being prepared for return to the community. Then, in May 2023, something happened that should have changed everything. While on a period of day release from Kirkham, supervised time outside the prison walls used to help prisoners reintegrate gradually, Roche was found in possession of a lock knife inside a bag. A convicted murderer, on day release, carrying a blade. He was not recalled to a higher security prison. He was not denied parole. 4 months later, in September 2023, Direece Roche walked out of prison on license. The implications of that decision, of what it meant to grant parole to a man who had been caught with a knife while already being given supervised freedom, would become horrifyingly clear less than a year later. But first, you need to understand who was waiting on the other side of that gate, living his ordinary life in South Manchester, completely unaware that his name had already been spoken in a conversation he knew nothing about. Finton McDwyer was 64 years old and lived on Platt Lane in the Fallowfield area of South Manchester. He was a widower. His sister Maureen, Roche's grandmother and the mother of Samantha, had passed away some years earlier. Finton was Maureen's brother, which made him Roche's great-uncle, and he was not a man who sought attention or drama. His sons describe him as a gentle giant, a true gentleman, in the words of one family tribute. He lived quietly with his 26-year-old son, Daniel, and with Sammy, a dog that had belonged to Maureen before she died. Finton had taken on Sammy after Maureen's passing, caring for the dog the way he cared for everything around him, steadily, without fuss, with affection. What Finton McDwyer did not know, could not have known, was that Roche had recently encountered him by chance. Approximately 6 weeks before his death, Finton had been walking Sammy in Fallowfield Park when he crossed paths with Roche. The two men spoke, and it was during that conversation that Roche learned something that would later prove significant to the case against him: the dog's name. Sammy had been named after Roche's own mother, Samantha. She had died in 2008, taking her own life as a young woman in her 30s. Before her death, she had written a letter in which she described being abused by an uncle as a child. That letter, and the grief and distortion it may have planted in Roche, would later become central to his defense. But first, there was a Sunday night in late June 2024. The night of 29th June 2024 was, for Finton McDwyer, an ordinary one. His son Daniel and his girlfriend were away for the evening at a wedding. Finton was alone in the house on Platt Lane, just himself and Sammy. CCTV from the camera he had installed in the living room, set up so he could keep an eye on the dog when he was out of the room, shows him going about his evening normally. He locked the back door. He went to bed. He's somewhere across Manchester. Roche was getting ready. He dressed in dark clothing. He put on a balaclava. At around 3:30 in the morning on June 30th, He made his way through the streets of South Manchester toward Platt Lane. CCTV from the area around the house captured him walking, a man in black, face covered, moving with clear purpose through quiet residential streets at a time when everyone around him was asleep. He reached the house. He found an upstairs window that had been left open. He climbed through it. What happened inside that bedroom lasted approximately 90 seconds. Investigators know this because the dog camera in the living room downstairs, the one Finton had set up to watch Sammy, captured audio. 90 seconds of sounds that no one should have to hear. 90 seconds in which Finton McDwyer, and a gentle, quiet man asleep in his own home, was attacked with a knife. He was stabbed 77 times. The wounds were to his face, his head, and his body. His jugular vein was severed. He was 64 years old, and he was alone, and he had no way to defend himself. When it was over, Roche left. CCTV caught him again, this time escaping over the fences of neighboring gardens, moving quickly away from the house. The following morning, July 1st, Daniel returned home from the wedding. He found his father in a pool of blood. He called emergency services. Paramedics arrived at 8:50 a.m. and confirmed what could not have been in any doubt from the state of the room. Finton McDwyer was gone. Sammy the dog was taken from the scene by officers. He now lives with Finton's eldest son, Jonathan. And Roche, he left something behind. Our detectives from Greater Manchester Police began piecing together what had happened almost immediately after Daniel's call came in. The CCTV network around Platt Lane had already done much of the initial work for them. Footage placed a masked figure, dressed in black, face covered, walking through the surrounding streets in the early hours of June 30th, moving toward the house. The same cameras captured him leaving, scaling garden fences in the streets behind the property, heading away at pace. As officers searched the gardens along Roche's escape route, they found something he had left behind. A small torch dropped in one of the neighboring gardens. It carried two things that would prove decisive in court: Finton McDwyer's blood and Roche's DNA. A blood smear on a nearby concrete post confirmed the direction of travel. His knife, his trainers, and his balaclava were never recovered, disposed of somewhere between Platt Lane and wherever he went next. The dog camera Finton had installed in the living room to keep an eye on Sammy had captured something else entirely: audio from the bedroom above. It gave investigators a precise timeline of what had happened and how long it had lasted. 90 seconds. Cross-referencing the CCTV footage, the forensic evidence from the escape route, and the audio, detectives built a picture that pointed clearly in one direction. 5 days after the murder, on 6th July 2024, Direece Roche was arrested. He sat across from investigators and said nothing. No comment from start to finish. Whatever calculations were running behind his silence, he had already decided that the story he intended to tell would be reserved for a courtroom, not a police interview room. He would get that courtroom, and what he said in it would be almost as shocking as what he had done on Platt Lane. The trial of Direece Roche at Manchester Crown Court in 2025 was, at its core, not a dispute about whether he had killed Finton McDwyer. He admitted being present. He admitted the killing. What he contested, the reason a jury was needed, was why. Roche's defense rested on two interlocking claims. First, that Finton McDwyer had sexually abused him as a child. Second, that on the night of the murder, McDwyer had run at him with a knife, and what followed was a simultaneous loss of control. A legal concept that, if accepted, he could reduce murder to manslaughter. He also told police, in one of his earlier explanations, that he had only gone to the house to steal the dog. Sammy, named after his mother. The prosecution, led by Bill Baker KC, dismantled each element methodically. On the abuse allegation, police had investigated the claims thoroughly. The evidence gathered, Baker told the court, refuted them. The allegations, he said, simply did not fit what was known about Finton McDwyer's life and character. His sons, who had known him their entire lives, described the claims as slanderous, blatant lies, fabricated by a man who had run out of other options. Baker put it plainly to the jury. The allegations had been callously fabricated to prove a false defense. On the question of motive, Baker raised another possibility. Roche's mother had taken her own life, and in her letter had written that she had been abused by an uncle. Baker noted there were 13 people she could have been referring to. The suggestion was that Roche may have incorrectly identified Finton McDwyer as the man responsible. A catastrophic, murderous mistake, built on grief and a misreading of an old letter. But even that, if true, did not constitute a legal defense for what he had done. The loss of control defense required the jury to believe that a 64-year-old man, asleep when his home was broken into in the middle of the night, had somehow then run at his attacker with a knife. The jury did not believe it, and the CPS successfully applied for Roche's previous murder conviction to be put before the jury, allowing them to see the full picture of the man who sat before them. Not a man acting out of trauma or confusion, a man who had killed before, who knew how to do it, and who had done it again. The jury convicted him of murder, and what came next was reserved for fewer than 100 prisoners in the entire UK prison system. Manchester Crown Court, September 2025. Mr. Justice Bright sentenced Direece Roche to a whole life order. It means exactly what it says. Roche will never be considered for parole again. He will die in prison. He joins fewer than 100 prisoners across a prison population of approximately 80,000 serving the same sentence. Among them are Lucy Letby, convicted of murdering babies in her care; Mark Fellows, known as the Iceman, a contract killer; Wayne Couzens, the former police officer who abducted and murdered Sarah Everard. The whole life order is reserved for cases that sit in a category of their own, where the nature of the crime and the character of the person who committed it make any prospect of release unconscionable. Mr. Justice Bright described Finton McDwyer as an entirely innocent person. He described the murder as premeditated, with significant planning. He looked at Roche and said, "My clear impression is that you have no remorse or regret of any kind." He also addressed something that had hung over the entire proceedings, the question of how this had been allowed to happen, how a man with a prior murder conviction, caught carrying a knife while on day release, had been granted parole and returned to the streets. The judge said the case would rightly raise questions about why Roche had ever been released, but he also offered a careful observation. He had sympathy for those who had made that decision because Roche had been deeply deceptive. The description of him as a model prisoner and a reformed character had not been invented out of thin air. He had constructed it deliberately, over years. The CPS's senior Crown prosecutor, Nicola Carter, speaking after the verdict, was measured but clear. Direece Roche planned and carried out the brutal murder of his own relative as he lay in bed. Roche attempted to conceal his identity by wearing a balaclava as he walked the streets of Manchester before and after murdering his great-uncle. The family of Finton McDwyer had sat through a trial in which the man who killed their father and grandfather had spent weeks in court telling the jury that Finton had been an abuser, that he had deserved in some distorted logic what had happened to him. The sons had been forced to listen to those allegations, knowing what they knew about who their father was. Jonathan, the eldest, spoke for the family in his victim impact statement. "On July 1st, 2024, the life of our family changed forever," he said. "You took away my leader, my hero, the most gentle and loving father I could ask for. And my role model, gone." He said Roche had told blatant lies about his father, and that those lies had only come when Roche found himself backed into a corner with the evidence against him. Daniel McDwyer said, "No one should ever think they have the right to take someone's life. You thought that justice was served, but ultimately you cowardly killed an elderly man while he was sleeping." Ryan, the youngest, said, "You are a coward for doing what you did to my dad, knowing he was not able to defend himself. I genuinely hope you never see the light of day again." They got that wish. Direece Roche will never see daylight as a free man again. There are two victims at the center of this story. Adam Steele, who was 23 years old and worked caring for people, and who went to a New Year's Eve party and never came home. And Finton McDwyer, who was 64 and cared for a dog named after a woman who had died too young, and was killed in his own bed by someone he shared a family with. Neither of them chose to be part of this. The question that haunts the Roche case, that will continue to haunt it, is not whether the parole system failed. The system worked with the information it had, and the information it had was wrong, because the person providing it was a skilled deceiver. A lock knife found during day release should perhaps have been enough to trigger a recall. That decision will be examined and re-examined by people with more authority over these matters than this script. But what is certain is this: the idea of rehabilitation is not wrong. People can change. The system has to believe that, because the alternative, locking every convicted killer away forever with no prospect of review, carries its own profound injustices. Most people who serve time for violence do not go on to kill again. Direece Roche did, and the cost of that was Finton McDwyer's life. For Jonathan, Daniel, and Ryan, for the family of Adam Steele, whose loss stretches back to a New Year's morning in 2011. The whole life order is not closure. There is no such thing. It is simply the end of the legal process and the beginning